You're listening to Pushing the Envelope, Life at the Cutting Edge of Customs Innovation. I'm Tom Muller with the Cross-Border Research Association. On this show, we explore the frontiers of customs creativity in conversations with customs and logistics experts, technology innovators, research scientists, and other leaders in the field. Industry insiders call the show the Pencast because it's part of PenCP, a network for boosting customs innovation funded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 program. Today, I'm very honored to be speaking with Ana Hinojosa, who has almost 35 years of experience in customs and border security, both in the U.S. and worldwide. She started in college at an entry-level position with the U.S. Customs Service in 1987 and worked her way up in 17 years to a senior executive level position and subsequently worked with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection as Area Port Director of LAX, Los Angeles, Director of Field Operations at El Paso, Texas, then Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the Office of International Affairs in Washington, D.C., and finally, Executive Director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, also in D.C. In the midst of this, she also served 4 years as Director of Compliance and Facilitation at the World Customs Organization, and she currently heads ABH Global Trade Consulting, where she shares her own expertise and that of a talented group of consultants in issues such as classification, valuation, rules of origin, audits, and forced labor. Hello, Ana, and welcome to Pushing the Envelope.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for inviting me to be on this podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation and learn more about Pencast and hopefully share a little bit of something of my experience.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of your major postings and a few of the highlights of your career. What attracted you to customs work in the first place?
Well, I started thinking about what career I wanted when I was a little girl, of course, and my father who was a humble man, World War II veteran, older gentleman, but very, I'm going to say, I don't know, somebody who really believed in his kids. And I often tell this to men across the world when I get the opportunity. My father, when I was a little girl, used to tell me I was so smart that I could do anything I wanted, anything, no matter what our current life situation is. You can do whatever you want as long as you work hard. You're so smart, you can do anything. And all of that I believed as a little girl because my daddy told me that was possible. And so I had dreams of becoming a lawyer, an attorney. As I grew up, I realized, that's not an easy thing to do. You actually have in the US, you have to get an undergraduate degree and then you have to go to law school. And it seemed, in my particular circumstances that was going to be a difficult situation, but the law was something that I was always attracted to. So I decided that I would pursue an undergraduate degree in criminal justice, and then after that, pursue law school, depending on where I was at the end of that. And so I started an undergraduate degree in criminal justice, and in those initial courses, I'd heard of this internship program that the university was offering with U.S. Customs, where students could work part of the year at Customs and study part of the year. And that sounded super fascinating for me. And so I tried to apply for it at the time, and they said, it was too early in my studies to qualify for that. But anyway, long story short, I studied criminal justice because I love laws and I love how that gets, enforced, how they get applied, how people interpret them. And when I did get the opportunity to, and that's a whole other story in and of itself, but when I finally did get an opportunity to join the internship program with Customs, I originally thought that was going to be a short-term, just a stepping stone to something else. Like I mentioned to you, I was thinking I was going to go to law school. And that first year, I started in Laredo, Texas, which is one of the largest southern border commercial ports in the U.S., right on the U.S.-Mexico border. Trucks and trains were the bulk of the type of commercial traffic that came through there. And it was early days. you and I just had a quick conversation, and it reminded me of some of the transactions back then where a lot of the broker representatives would have to carry a little dot matrix typewriter with them and carbon paper because they had to make changes to the documentations when they made mistakes. And so they would pull it out on their knees and retype the documents and reuse their carbon paper. And then, and we had just started with the amber screen computers, and it was right before the harmonized tariff schedule was implemented in the US. And so it was a fascinating time back then.
You worked your way up from a college intern to a senior executive level position through more or less 17 years of hard work. But you also transitioned from dot matrix printing and amber screens through 9/11, through the 2003 Homeland Security restructuring of the entire Customs and Border Protection world. I mean, you've seen transformations that most people just read about.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I think, a lot of people talk about how they change, I guess, companies or change organizations that they work with over time, and they don't understand how you could stay with one organization. Well, for me, my organization changed every couple of years, and so it stayed dynamic, and the jobs were always evolving, and I moved 10 times in my career, so it was literally different organizations that I was working in, different jobs, different responsibilities. And I think I'm a perpetual learner, and so I think that that really helped. That there's always something new to learn and always something new to adapt to, and I feel extremely blessed for the opportunities I've had.
Well, you certainly didn't have any time to get bored with 10 moves and a constant transformation, some world historic terrorist activities in the meantime, restructuring. It is quite an exciting thing. I mean, I don't imagine ultimately you missed law school too much since 1987. You've been interpreting and enforcing the laws on behalf of the U.S. government and driving international standards, compliance, and so on. I mean, in a sense, you did more than any lawyer could do.
Over the years, I've come to realize that although I didn't go to law school, my practical experience has given me quite a bit of legal knowledge. And so I've had the opportunity to, I don't know if I want to say maybe debate people who have gone to law school over interpretation and application of the laws, and been quite successful. So I feel like I didn't quite miss out that much, but I do still love the laws and how they apply new legislation that's being promulgated all over the world, and how that's now that I've had such an experience working with so many countries around the world, really understanding how a change in the law in the UK, for example, can have an impact in Asia, and can have an impact in the US, it can have an impact obviously with the EU, and how the markets work and all of that. And so it's been super exciting, and I still am excited every time I think about the work that we do.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised. And as you say, it's a constantly evolving and dynamic environment that you're working in, constant new challenges. Speaking of challenging, in a previous conversation, you described your work as the area port director for customs at LAX in Los Angeles at a time of the merger into Homeland Security as the hardest job you've ever had. Do you stand by that? And if so, why was it the hardest job and the most complicated job?
Yeah, it was definitely the hardest job I've ever had, but also the one job I would never want to miss out on. It was a 24/7 situation post 9/11. Merger issues, and just to describe that a little bit, in the Customs and Border Protection area within the Office of Field Operations. So there was 4 different pieces of other agencies that came together under Customs and Border Protection. One of those pieces I'm not really going to talk about because that was the Office of Border Patrol and they do a different function. But the other three pieces all kind of came together within the Office of Field Operations. And so from an airport environment, I was designated the interim port director to oversee the merger at LAX. And that brought the immigration inspection staff, the agriculture inspection staff, and the customs staff. And it was, everybody was shell shocked. Everybody felt like they got the bad end of the deal. Everybody felt like it was a hostile takeover for their organization.
Right.
And so it's really kind of like a master class, like living a master class in organizational change, culture change, and really helping employees deal with the grief of change. That has been that was such an eye-opening experience. And every day it was a new experience, and you hope that your instincts, because it was brand new territory, it was things that nobody had lived before. And so I was leading from a place of really having to use my instincts rather than a roadmap to do it. Obviously, there were national guidelines on some of these things, but the things that we were facing at LAX were somewhat unique in that we had, I think, 65 different foreign consulates in the Los Angeles area. So there was quite a bit of kind of international engagement. It's one of the biggest gateways into the U.S., especially from Asia, but from all over the world. And then, that other country that is, I'm going to call it a country, but really maybe its own little world, Hollywood being in the Los Angeles area. A lot of the studios and movie stars and wannabe movie stars come in and out of LAX. And so the dynamics of dealing with those personalities and people who think that they're an A-listed star, but not quite an A-listed star, and everybody wanted preferential treatment was very, very interesting. Very interesting.
So you had to deal with Planet Hollywood as well as 60 or 65.
Exactly.
And if I remember correctly, you had some surprising Hollywood-related responsibilities, and sometimes actually pleasant, not just people full of themselves, but also people who are very famous who were fairly understated and serious about their jobs. Tell me a little bit about your work on the film The Terminal.
Yeah, so it was really interesting, but at this point, I was a bit. I don't know if jaded is the right word, but, kind of a bit disappointed.
Exhausted might be a good word.
that was a good word. Definitely exhausted, but a bit, disillusioned a little bit with all of the Hollywood hype, with everybody, thinking they were special. And I mean, obviously some people are special, but everybody wanting special treatment. If everybody wants special treatment, then nobody gets special treatment, right?
Right.
And so with the filming of the movie The Terminal, it was a project that the Department of Homeland Security was interested in supporting. So Customs and Border Protection had assigned an expert to work with them at the studio where they were filming the movie. And that wasn't me. I was busy actually running LAX. So I was busy dealing with that. But as the experts were working with the studio and just, I have to name drop because it's who the people were that were involved, but Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, Stan Tucci, Catherine Zeta-Jones, and other people were the people that were involved in this particular movie. Mm-hmm. The studio was actually, they had a set that they built out somewhere in the desert. And so normally these people weren't in and around the airport. They were off during the filming in that location. But apparently Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg really wanted to get a sense of what the airport was really like, not just what the expert was telling them or, some of the scripts that they had been looking at, but they really wanted to get a good feel for what the operations were like. So I was called and asked if they could come for a quick tour because they really wanted to get a better, live feel for the operations. And so I said, oh, what am I going to say? No, of course, but again, I took it a little bit more like a chore rather than a pleasant experience. I wasn't expecting a pleasant experience out of it because we were so busy, so many different things were on our plates that this was kind of having to take time out of that to fit this in was a bit of a challenge.
You've already had some experience. You had already had some experience with people who you felt were pretty full of themselves and expecting special treatment. So with big names like this, you might have expected the same.
Right. And so, we made arrangements on the day that they were coming to meet Tom Hanks first in the public area of the Tom Bradley terminal at LAX. And so I went out there with 3 or 4 of my uniform managers. And so we're walking towards the meeting place that we've told him we're going to go. And we see him coming, from across the terminal, the big lobby area. He's walking our way. He's wearing nondescript jeans, a short sleeve polo t-shirt with a baseball cap and some sunglasses. If we weren't looking for him, I would have not even noticed him because he was, like a nondescript man, in this attire. And so we're walking towards him. All of a sudden we hear squealing, like screaming and squealing, and people rushing this man with their cameras and their phones trying to take pictures of him. And he's in the middle there, almost being accosted by all these people wanting, I would not have recognized him, but that speaks to me, and so we approached him and, got the people away from him and then escorted him into our area. That really gave me a much better understanding of their life. It's not necessarily that they're special human beings, but the celebrity status that they've achieved, granted through a lot of hard work in most cases, is also kind of eliminates some of their freedom. They don't have the ability to walk around like you and I do. They don't have the ability to kind of be free to not be accosted or have their picture taken at every opportunity that they show their face outside their own compound.
Right. They're sort of prisoners of their own fame.
Right. And so then we got Tom inside, and then they picked up Stan Tucci and Steven Spielberg from another location and got them in. They were super curious at everything, including the pictures on the wall, how different people interact, what does the port director really say? What do the officers really say? So they really were very, very curious about that because they wanted to be respectful and not let the Hollywood script kind of give the wrong impression of what the work was about. And so, as we gave them the tour, I came to appreciate that they are really nice people. They have, at least Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks have a very close friendship. And nothing arrogant about any of them. They were so gracious and thankful that we were giving them the tour. They were so in awe of the work that we were doing. And they took some of the things that they saw and incorporated them into the movie because they felt like that was things that people wouldn't believe were there. I think during the time that they were there, we had just recently caught some opium in these walnuts, where somebody had hollowed out walnuts, put opium bags inside, and like re-glued the walnuts, and we had caught them at the terminal, and so they incorporated some of that into the movie. And Amazing. Then I didn't tell you, but they had the original red carpet event in New York, I think, and then they had another event in Hollywood, and we were invited to go, which was
That's
really
really
another very
cool.
cool thing. Yeah.
Classy, very classy. That's great.
Yeah.
I loved that film at the time, and I remember thinking, "Wow!" Well, first of all, I didn't realize I should have thought that they made a special fake terminal out in the desert where they could do what they wanted. I remember thinking, whoever organized this had a real handful, but also it just felt so authentic, and I'm beginning to understand why.
Yeah, they spent a lot of time making sure that, and DHS was a new department of the government, so they were very concerned with making sure that the portrayal of the government wasn't off, that it wasn't, coming across as a lighthearted, jokester kind of thing. That's not what a new government wants to have itself portrayed as. And I think that the collaboration agreement with the studio really brought to light the fact that they wanted to make sure that they had an expert and that they had a say in how the government was portrayed.
Right. Right. Well, that certainly came across as respectful, accurate, but not softball either. I mean, it wasn't a piece; it was a proper film about some real issues. I found it fascinating, and I'm really glad to hear that the backstory on it is as appealing as the film itself. So, after your hardest job, you move on to another incredibly hard job. I mean, it sounds to me like El Paso, where you led over 1,000 people doing very complex and diverse missions. Trade compliance, agriculture compliance, immigration processing, keeping the good people and the good things flowing while the bad people and the bad things are filtered out. Tell me a little bit about El Paso.
El Paso was an interesting. I grew up on the southern border of the United States, so I'm familiar with border areas. I'd been through El Paso before because at one point, remember, I moved many times for the government. At one point, I lived in San Diego, and my family, my parents lived down in South Texas. So we had to cross El Paso and in visiting them. But that was the extent of my experience with El Paso. When I went to El Paso, or when I was asked to go to El Paso, it was at the height of the drug cartel wars in Juarez, which is the big city on the Mexican side of the border. And if you've never been to El Paso, as you drive on Highway 10, which crosses, from California to Texas, you're driving on the U.S. highway, but there's a chain link fence that you can see the Mexican side of the border there. So if you can see it, bullets can reach you, bad things. You get to see bad things if they're happening there. And it was a really difficult time for the citizens of Juarez, but also for the law enforcement community, because the drug cartel wars were very, very vicious. And in the Mexican media doesn't have the same kind of filters as the U.S. media has with regards to publishing gory pictures. So there were a lot of decapitations. There were hanging bodies. There were things that were done to people's bodies that were very public. So it wasn't just like, oh, we found three bodies shot, or we found, 3 heads, not with their torsos, but you actually saw the pictures and the blood and the gore and the guts pulled out, or different parts of the bodies, mutilated. And it was daily. There were these types of very violent cases that happen, and for our staff, it was extremely challenging. You can't even describe it the way it happens, but we had many situations where at that time the Mexican military was policing the city because the local police departments just couldn't, were intimidated, were corrupted, whatever the case may be. They could just not handle the security of the city. And so they brought in the Mexican military. Most of these Mexican military guys, in order to avoid some of the corruption aspects, the Mexican government would bring people from the military from southern states in Mexico so they wouldn't have any relationships to the people that they were policing.
Mm-hmm.
But that also meant that they didn't really understand the geography. And so sometimes they'd be chasing, you'd have this armed, we'll call it a big pickup truck with military guys with long arms, automatic weapons, chasing some bad guys headed to the border. And they'd get up on the bridge, and sometimes they'd come across the bridge, guns loaded, guns pointed, and our officers at the border had to stop them, disarm them, take them into custody, keep the situation safe in the midst of plenty of pedestrians, plenty of other normal border crossers in the space. And it was a super challenging thing. We had a couple of cases where people would rush to the border from Mexico because they'd just been shot. And so our folks are having to do first aid on bullet wounds and different other types of medical emergencies. We had a terrible case where a father ran to the border with his child. I think it was like a 2 or 3 year old child that had been shot. And he's running with this bleeding child to our officers to get help. And the child died, unfortunately. But that trauma for our officers was horrible because they're not robots. They're humans. And even though you can somewhat, disassociate yourself a little bit from adults that are, they were in the wrong place at the very least, or they're doing bad things, more likely. You can disassociate yourself from that and just deal with the professional side of it. Our officers are parents. Our officers are grandparents, or, they're humans. And we had to bring in, crisis counselors several times to have our officers deal with just the blood and gore and emergency crisis situation that they were dealing with on a daily basis.
My gosh, it sounds like a war zone. I mean, it really, in a sense, was a war zone.
It was a war zone, but the dichotomy of it all, at the time that Juarez had the highest record of homicides, El Paso had the lowest record of homicides in El Paso. So there's a lot of cross-border movement every day. Tens of thousands of people cross that border. Tens of thousands of trucks cross that border, rail containers, etc. And it just was a fascinating time as well. I mean, I don't know how I've been blessed to have all of these exciting experiences.
Well, I don't think everyone is up for those exciting experiences. They would probably have overloaded. But I mean, how long were you in doing this in El Paso?
For 5 years.
5 years. That's a serious stint of active duty. And that even if El Paso has a low homicide rate, that the people across the border, you are potentially in contact with them or with their workers who are smuggling drugs across the border on a daily basis, right? I mean, and any vehicle you stop could potentially be connected with that.
Right. And in many cases, they lived in the U.S. side or had houses on the U.S. side, and they would come to the U.S. side on the weekends. So the weekends were always super packed. They had El Paso had something like 97% occupancy rate on the weekends for the hotels because people would just leave Juarez to get a break, from the killings, to get a break, to go eat at a restaurant in peace, or the dichotomy was just so palpable. People would come to just go sit with their family at a restaurant, which they couldn't no longer do in Juarez. Juarez is a vibrant, huge city. Over 1 million people live in Juarez. El Paso is a smaller community, but big military base in El Paso. Lots of law enforcement in El Paso, lowest crime rate in the country in El Paso, highest murder rate in Juarez. It was quite the interesting time.
Wow, that's incredible. How are things now? I mean, you obviously kept up with the conditions. Is the war sort of in a cooler phase, or has it just morphed into something else?
So I think it ebbs and flows, and
Mm,
recently there have been some new apprehensions, things like that.
mhm.
The border has become very complicated all along the U.S. Mexico border. So
Oh boy.
at the time, the big war was in El Paso or in Juarez.
Hmm.
I would say that the cartel wars have just kind of erupted all throughout the northern part of Mexico. And so
Mm,
it's no longer unique. It's almost an accepted risk, I guess we'll call it that. And then,
right.
most recently, and I'm not trying to make a political statement, but know that I've spent 35 years of my life on the border. And I mean, I at least working career life, my grew up on the border. So
Yeah.
practically my whole life has been actually on the US Mexico border. And the cartels have found new money making opportunities, and
Mm,
that has been, certainly fentanyl. And I mean, to realize that at some point the Chinese government, or not the Chinese government, but the Chinese companies were actually producing fentanyl and importing it into Mexico, and then that the fentanyl and other synthetic drugs started making their way into the U.S. as finished drugs.
mm,
But as fentanyl started growing in popularity, the cartels cut out the Chinese manufacturers, and
mm.
they started just importing the raw material, and they make their own synthetic drugs now in Mexico. So it's very dangerous for Mexico because every transshipment country has become a user country in history, if you look at it.
Mm.
Because you maybe can't move the product as fast, or because you have surplus, and why not sell to domestic users, and it just creates an epidemic everywhere that you are. But further, the other commodity, human trafficking,
Mm,
has really grown. The
mm.
cartels find, I mean, it's been years that this has been growing. But where there's opportunities, the cartels find, the human trafficking to be a very profitable business. And so that creates all kinds of other issues associated with that.
Why is it so profitable? Is it people are desperate to get across the border and they will pay any amount of money, well, any amount of money they can lay their hand on to do it? Or is there some new development that's caused, are they also trafficking, transporting drugs? Or it's a big question, I realize.
Yeah, all of the above,
Mm,
also some of the human trafficking that turns into sexual exploitation.
right,
It's the smuggling that keeps on giving, because then
right.
they continue to get paid, for, these in human, in human exploitation, in whichever form that takes.
This concludes the first part of my Pencast conversation with Ana Hinojosa, former Executive Director of U.S. Customs and Borders Protection and current head of ABH Global Trade Consulting. Tune in soon for the second part of our talk. Thank you.